Impact investing is often framed as a win-win, generating financial returns while advancing social and environmental goals. But beneath that promise lies a complex financial architecture that shapes who holds risk, who has power, and how success is ultimately defined and measured. In this episode, we take a closer look at the core instruments behind impact investing and how these tools influence relationships between investors and social enterprises. We also trace the roots of impact investing back to its original roots in socially responsible investing, to the origins of microfinance, examining how early efforts to expand access to capital laid the groundwork for impact investing as we see it today. Along the way, we unpacked persistent challenges around measuring social impact and how reporting expectations can create unintended burdens for the very organizations these investments aim to support. I am joined by Dr. Peter Hinton, impact investor and associate fellow at Saïd Business School at the University of Oxford.
Well, very good to be with you. Thank you for having me. I've been involved in investing in Africa for the last 25 years or so, and seeking to achieve a development impact as well as a financial return for investors. So I've been doing that initially in the banking sector to try and get funding into small and medium-sized enterprises in East and West Africa and Southern Africa, and more recently looking at the whole area of low-cost schools that are educating the majority of children in the 7 cities I researched for my PhD in East and West and Southern Africa, and they have a problem accessing credit. So just like microfinance years ago, where female entrepreneurs were seen as uncreditworthy, but also these low-cost schools providing childcare, early years and primary education, and not receiving credit from the banks. So I'm working on trying to unlock that block in the pipeline, as it were.
Rooted in development economics, microfinance is a type of banking service that provides access to financial services to individuals and small enterprises who are typically excluded from or do not have access to traditional banking systems. With the social goal of unlocking human potential through poverty reduction by increasing access to capital, microfinance challenged conventional assumptions about creditworthiness. Muhammad Yunus is often credited with pioneering microfinance. In 1983, he launched Grameen Bank on the belief that lending small loans to groups of low-income women offered a pathway to lifting women from poverty.
So I do that probably 80% of my time. The other 20% I teach at Oxford at the Saïd Business School on impact investing, on social finance, and also on sustainable economic growth, leadership and management. So I kind of have one foot in the academic world and another foot in the practical world.
One of the reasons I was particularly interested in speaking with you is because you really sit at the intersection of theory and practice. Not only are you deeply immersed in the evolving world of impact investing, seeing firsthand how capital is deployed with the intention to generate both financial return and measurable social or environmental impact, but you're also shaping the next generation of investors and entrepreneurs. Impact investing has grown exponentially. According to recent figures from the Global Impact Investing Network, the size of the worldwide impact investing market is at around $1.571 trillion. So to ground us in today's conversation, I'm hoping you could help us start with the basics. What is impact investing, and how has its definition evolved over the years?
Okay, so when we started teaching on impact investing at Oxford about 13 years ago, it was quite a new idea. And it evolved out of conversations between Rockefeller Foundation and various other philanthropic organizations. And that's where they termed the phrase impact investing to say, okay, impact investors are looking for a financial return and a social return. Both are equally important. And that's really where the idea came up. But rather than giving money away through a philanthropic methodology, actually, can you invest in enterprises, social enterprises, for-profit enterprises, but where the clear intention is to actually have a social impact and where the financial return is appropriate. And that financial return may be return of capital. It may be more than return of capital, but it should be suitable to the context and the sector. But what was important to impact investors when it was termed as a phrase was, can we achieve both a financial return and a social return? When we teach with my colleagues at Oxford on impact investing, in the room, we have big investment banks. We have foundations, family offices, philanthropic organizations, and then we have non-government organizations all looking at impact investing to say, we want to do this, or should we do this, or can we do it, and can we do it better? Because it's a more potentially sustainable form of financing activity which has social outcomes, which is what people are interested in.
Impact investments are made with the intention to generate positive, measurable social and environmental impact alongside a financial return. Social impact can be interpreted in many forms, from job creation to give back business models that reinvest in community projects and social enterprises that are committed to fair wages. Before the Rockefeller Foundation coined the term impact investing in the early 2000s, socially responsible investing can be traced back to faith-based traditions such as riba in Islam, which prohibits investments in things such as alcohol, pork, and gambling. In the United States, around the 18th century, Methodists who firmly rejected the slave trade and what they saw as immoral consumption refused to invest in industries that produced alcohol, tobacco, or promoted gambling. Similarly, Quaker communities avoided investments tied to slavery and warfare. For these groups, their investment choices reflected their moral and religious values. These approaches, referred to as socially responsible investing, emphasize ethical and moral considerations. They often use negative screening to avoid investing in industries such as gambling and firearms, aligning personal values with the broader societal impact. However, the term impact investing, as we understand it today, didn't emerge until the early 2000s. From there, the Global Impact Investing Network was established with the goal of uniting impact investors across the globe to build standards, share knowledge, and grow the field collectively.
Okay, so if you look at the Global Impact Investing Network website, they try and record how much money is going into impact investing on an annual basis, and they try and look at who's doing it and what the results have been, what's been good, what's not been so good. And they've tracked that it's growing at over 20% per annum over the last few years. So it seems to be gathering more momentum. And yet, when you look at the money being raised, the vast majority of it goes in the form of debt. So it's investing, but it's in the form of debt rather than equity or quasi-equity. And so that's a kind of consistent picture that you get, that and most of the money is coming from the northern hemisphere rather than from the southern hemisphere. So there's most of the pension funds that might be investing in this space, or the insurance companies, tend to be from the north rather than from the south. Now, that's not to say that's the whole picture. So, for example, a colleague of mine runs Vox Capital in Brazil, and most of their capital has come from Brazilian investors. And so you are seeing examples of impact investing funds attracting local domestic capital. And I think that's a trend that one would like to see increase and grow, so that Kenyan pension funds or Ghanaian pension funds or South African pension funds or Thai pension funds, just like the Brazil one, can actually put money into this space, so it becomes a much more balanced source of finance for impact.
What you're pointing to here is a powerful paradox at the heart of the impact investing world. On the one hand, growth is undeniable, but beneath that growth lies a more complex picture around global power structures, with the majority of capital still structured as debt, which can often be seen as less risky and more controllable by investors. And critically, decision-making power remains with northern institutions, even though many of the communities meant to benefit from these investments are in the global south. When capital comes from domestic investors, it doesn't just change the origin of the funds. It has the potential to reshape the approach to investment. Of course, there will always be a power differential between investors and beneficiaries. However, I would like to believe that the more we see growth of domestic impact investors in the global south, the more we see the opportunity for culturally informed approaches to impact. When investment is guided by local values and priorities, it not only fosters greater trust, it also challenges the one size fits all models that we often see accompany capital from the global north. That said, we see these same issues in philanthropy.
So the reason why impact investing was of interest to Rockefeller Foundation, for example, and other philanthropic bodies was rather than giving a one-off grant of, say, $5 million, $50 million, $500,000, whatever the amount might be, the advantage or attraction of impact investing was if you could invest it in an entity which was going to have an impact, you'd achieve your social objectives and you get your money back, potentially with a return, and you could recycle it. So rather than making a one-off grant of, say, $5 million, you make an impact investment of $5 million and you get that back, you can reuse that maybe 10 times. So effectively, you're deploying $50 million rather than just $5 million. The other advantage is it brings more accountability from recipient and provider. So the impact investor has a responsibility and is more engaged potentially with how that money is used and can play an active role potentially at board level or advisory level to help the entity that's taken that money to use it as well as best they can to achieve the impact that's been looked for. And also it makes the recipient more accountable in terms of how that money is used, because at the end of the day, the investor is looking for their financial return as well as the social return. So I think and when it's used to its best, it helps everybody in a partnership. So it's collaborative and it's working together to achieve both the financial return objectives and the social return objectives. So I think impact investing potentially reduces dependency and promotes partnership.
I think that cuts both ways. On one hand, impact investing brings much needed capital, but when they're generalists without deep contextual knowledge of the sector or community they're investing in, I have seen it create a real disconnect. That lack of insight can lead to misaligned expectations based on industry or even inadvertently impose external frameworks that don't fully reflect the lived realities of the communities being served. And of course, the dynamics also shift depending on the type of financial instruments being used, whether it's equity, debt, or something in between.
I think obviously it's a case-by-case situation, and that will depend on the relationship between the investor and the investee. It depends on the role that they're going to play. Are they going to be on the board or are they a debt provider? That changes the dynamic. But a true impact investor will be there for the long term, not the short term. The social impact is equally important to the financial return. And it's in both investee and investor's interest to have successful outcome in both. And so I think the tension can exist, but as with any investment, if it's the right combination of people, and the thing to remember is investors are not there just to put money to work and stand back. They should be constructively involved and they should be playing a role. So if it's a good investor relationship and if there's alignment between investor and investee, then they're in it together. And that's where I think it's a healthy situation.
To understand how capital flows through the impact investing ecosystem, it's important to look at the core financial tools that structure these investments. In impact investing, there are three key financial instruments used to support social enterprises, each with its own risk and return profile: equity, quasi-equity, and debt.
So say you've got a company in Ghana that's trying to increase the use of renewable energy. And promote solar power, for example. And if you take an equity stake, you'll be buying shares in that company. So say you take a 20% stake That money goes into the company. If the company does well, you'll hopefully get dividends on those shares, and potentially you'll be able to sell those shares to somebody else in the future to actually get your capital back.
Equity investors often take on more risk. So if the company fails, you could lose your investment.
Quasi-equity is the next kind of layer down in the capital structure, which is often in the form of preference shares. So preference shares have a yield. So you might get a 5% dividend yield on your preference shares, but you'll only get that if there's profit in the company. And therefore, you will get that money back with profits, and you'll also be able to get your capital back because the company can repay you from profits to actually redeem those preference shares. So you don't if the company ends up being worth a lot of money, you won't participate necessarily in that, but you will get your capital back and your 5% return. If you provide debt, then you'll get your interest on that debt and your capital back on the debt. So and you rank above preference shares and equity and ordinary shares in the event of a winding up of the company. So debt is the more secure form of providing finance, but it means that if the company does well, you'll only get your debt back.
Having seen clients navigate the terms of debt investments, one thing is clear. The burden of risk in the case of debt investments is carried by the investees, not the investor. Debt is more secure for investors because it functions like a loan. Terms can include liquidation clauses that force social enterprises, particularly ones in the consumer goods space, to liquidate their assets to ensure repayment of debt.
Impact investing, by definition, should be more patient than commercial finance. And therefore, you should actually end up with more of a grace period before any interest is due to be paid, and a longer term period of finance. So, 3 to 5 years, I would argue, for impact investing is too short. So most impact funds that you see typically are kind of for 10-year periods with a 2-year extension period. So investments should be between minimum 7 years and potentially 12 years. I think that range is a more sensible time horizon for an impact investor to be considering. The other thing that's worth mentioning is with currency risk, if you're investing in emerging markets, there's typically a currency risk.
Hard currency refers to a widely accepted and stable currency that is trusted by international trade and investment, such as the US dollar. It holds its value over time and is easily convertible. Local currency, on the other hand, is the official currency used within a specific country, like the Kenyan shilling or Indian rupee, and may be more volatile or harder to exchange internationally.
If you're investing in equity, you take on that currency risk. If you invest in preference shares, you might denominate the preference shares in hard currency, dollars, in which case all the currency risk passes to the investee. And debt can either be local currency or hard currency. But if it's in hard currency, the currency risk sits with the borrower. So those are issues that need to be looked at in terms of what's fair and equitable in an investment. So let's take a direct example in Nigeria, where in my PhD research, I did a case study on a low-cost school in Lagos called Lekki Peninsula School that had attracted impact investing finance. And they borrowed money to grow and expand this school so they could provide better and more quality education. And this was started by a Nigerian female entrepreneur who saw the need on her doorstep for education for young people. So she got this impact investing money, but it was in hard currency. And therefore it looked attractive because it was around 6% interest rate over, I think, 5 years. However, with the devaluation of the Naira, the repayment of that doubled and then tripled because she had to pay that back in hard currency finance. So that when you did the calculations, she would have been better off borrowing locally at 35% than borrowing at 6% in hard currency, which ended up being a similar cost of finance at the end of the day because of the devaluation. So all that risk was put onto her as a borrower. To be fair to the impact investors, they were forbearing, and they said, we made this investment because we wanted impact. And so they didn't require her to repay the full dollar amount that was due. But the reality was the devaluation of the currency meant that legally she was obliged to pay back the funding at a much higher cost than it would have been had there not been devaluation. And most currencies do devalue against the US dollar over time.
That example really drives home the complexities of impact investing in practice, especially when it comes to currency risk. For entrepreneurs operating in the global south, hard currency loans can carry hidden vulnerabilities that ultimately shift the financial burden onto the very people these investments are meant to support. As you mentioned, it raises important questions about how risk is shared or not, especially in cross-border financial relationships. So, how do political and economic power asymmetries then shape where impact investment flows?
Okay, so the company that one's providing finance to will be subject to political and economic situations. And if you've taken an equity stake in that company, you will therefore be there for the ups and downs. Whereas if you've taken another instrument, which is what impact investing historically has done, more of debt than any other instrument, you're actually putting more risk onto the investee. And as an investor, you're trying to protect yourself from those political and economic risks. I would argue that I would question whether that was fair or equitable. And going back to your question about power, sometimes I think people with money and power can say, well, you can either have this money on these conditions or you won't get it. And therefore they use that position of power to actually force an unfair arrangement rather than sharing the risk. So I think impact investing, when it's done well, looks at the risks involved, political, economic, and in particular, and says, how do we, what's the fair and equitable way of sharing this risk rather than putting all that risk onto the recipient?
As we discussed earlier, microfinance emerged to fill a critical gap in access to capital, particularly for those excluded from traditional financial systems. In many ways, impact investing seems to be doing something similar, channeling capital towards social enterprises that don't necessarily fit traditional paradigms of profit-maximizing returns. Can you share examples of projects where impact capital has stepped up in that traditional finance just doesn't go?
With impact investing, the return that you're looking for should be informed by the social impact you're looking to achieve as well. So you're not there just to make sure you get the best return possible. You're trying to get the appropriate return for the risk you're taking in the context you're investing in and in the light of the social impact you're trying to achieve as well. So, for example, an organization in Kenya called Jackfruit looks to finance SME schools operating in low-income areas, often run by women, and is using technology to get finance into that space. Ed Partners is another organization doing the same kind of thing, and therefore they are trying to get finance into an underserved part of the Kenyan economy, which should lead to improved education outcomes. So therefore, the social impact goes hand in hand with the financial return. They have to have a longer term horizon, and they have to work with those schools, not only to get their money back, but also to improve the quality of education in those schools. So you have to work with the schools in terms of leadership. You have to work with the schools in terms of what they're doing in the classroom and the teachers and improving the quality of teachers. And you have to, at some point, measure the learning outcomes. So I think that gives you an example of where impact investing can actually play a long-term beneficial role and where commercial money wouldn't go in. So when I looked at 7 cities in Africa, in terms of finance for these low-cost schools, only 15% of them, 15%, had been able to get bank finance. So that's an area of exclusion. And that's similar to microfinance, 30 years ago, when Mohammed Yunus started Grameen Bank. he saw the opportunity of potentially lending money to female entrepreneurs who the banks wouldn't touch. It's a similar situation. And he demonstrated, as did other microfinance providers, that these women entrepreneurs were creditworthy, contrary to what the banks thought. That had a big social impact on Bangladesh and other societies. I've just been at an income sharing agreement group of practitioners. So these are organizations that finance vocational training in developed and developing markets. And the way they do it is by financing somebody through that vocational training. Often these individuals are from low-income backgrounds, so they wouldn't be able to afford the vocational training if the organizations like Chanson, for example, in Rwanda, weren't there to provide the finance and the human support. But the deal is when a person comes through the other end of the training, whether it's plumbing, electricians, or whatever it might be, it could be coding, for example, and tech skills, they contribute back 10% of their income to the organization until they've contributed back, say, 1.8 times the cost of investment. They also become coaches and mentors for other people receiving training. So as that money comes back, they can reinvest that in other people. This is, I think, a very interesting and exciting way of financing vocational training on a sustainable level, but we're using an impact investing mindset of how do we make this investment, how do we get social impact, and how do we recycle that money so it can be used time and time again.
One of the primary challenges I've observed in impact investing relationships is the tension around how social impact is defined, measured, and reported. Metrics are meant to serve a clear purpose. They help ensure accountability, enhance transparency, and guide decisions. But when it comes to social impact, measurement is anything but straightforward. Unlike the climate space, where science-based targets and standardized frameworks provide a clear path, social impact exists in a far more complex terrain. It's deeply context-specific, shaped by cultural, political, and social realities that don't easily lend themselves to standardized, uniform indicators. It also depends on the types of issues that different organizations might be trying to address. What counts as meaningful impact in one context might look entirely different in another. After all, social impact doesn't scale like a business. It's not always linear or easy to replicate. So how is the impact investing space navigating the nuance required or challenges posed by quantifying social impact?
You're quite right. It does vary on sector to sector. So medical credit fund, I know reasonably well in the Netherlands, they try and get money into SMEs providing health services in Africa because half of health provision is provided by the non-government sector. And these small and medium-sized enterprises need finance to grow and expand and buy equipment and material. But the banks typically, as we know, tend to be averse to lending to small and medium-sized enterprises. So medical credit fund was set up to try and meet that financial need. But they measure their impact just like a hotel, from 1 star to 5 star. And so they measure the impact if a small and medium-sized enterprise health provider increases its rating from 1 star to 2 or 3 star. Similarly, they'll look at access and affordability, and they'll try and measure whether low-income people have access to that health provision. So I think the metrics being used do depend on the sector, but they should be identifiable and they should be measurable. The cost involved with collecting that information should be as low as possible. In some cases I've seen, you can actually end up with the cost of measurement being disproportionate to the activity and the investment taking place. That's the tail wagging the dog. You need to get the right balance so that it can be done properly and efficiently.
Absolutely. One concern I've often heard from social enterprises is we'd love to work with impact investors, but the expectations around metrics and reporting are just so rigid. We're worried we won't have the capacity to keep up, or it'll require more monetary and time investment than is reasonable for our organization. When measurement becomes disconnected from on-the-ground realities, it can shift valuable time and resources away from the actual work that's creating impact.
Yeah, and that goes back to your power question earlier. where the provider says you need to measure these things regardless of the cost or the time it will take up, that's not a partnership. The impact investor in that situation should be really taking the lead from the recipient, but also from the ultimate beneficiaries that the recipient company is trying to reach, and listen to their voice and identify what's important to them, not to the provider. So can be a bit of a problem with impact investors or philanthropists generally, that they have their own agenda and they force that agenda onto the recipient rather than it being a true partnership. I think it's quite important to be willing to listen, and listen quite hard to what the ultimate social impact is going to be and who that is designed to reach and what those recipients have to say about this. And if they're not happy or they don't feel it's appropriate, then the investor and the intermediary need to actually listen to that.
I appreciate you highlighting the importance of listening to the ultimate beneficiaries, not just the social enterprise or implementing partner, but the communities and individuals directly impacted. That kind of listening can be a real strength when done well, but it can also become a missed opportunity when it's overlooked or treated as an afterthought. So I'd love to hear what strategies or practices you've seen that successfully center beneficiary voices.
One is using local institutions to do the measurement and evaluation work, rather than just being northern consultants going in and doing the work. You'll find people across the world to do the measurement and evaluation. Whereas if you use local universities or technical colleges or even local consultancy bodies to do the measurement and evaluation, that would actually help, because I think they'll be better at it. They'll be more attuned to the cultural context and the language challenges. My colleague Ruta Nimkar runs an entity called Meraki Labs. I just think their approach is really quite powerful and is very unusual, actually. So the recipients themselves do the research to establish the impact from the community. So they work with the community to actually hear what the impact has been, not what the donors or the investors think it should be, or what the actual implementing social enterprise or company in the middle think it's been. But they actually work with the community to hear. So when she and her colleagues do work, for example, in Jordan or the Horn of Africa with refugees, they actually use refugees to do the research. I think that's quite a powerful way of making sure that you hear reality, not what you'd like to hear. And again, technology is quite helpful here. I know people in South Africa who use research methodology to interview recipients on the ground from the community in their own language, and they then translate. So the questions are translated into their indigenous language. They record the responses. They then have people interpreting those responses to make sure they are honest and not done under pressure. And then they feed that back to make sure they've heard it properly. So you're using artificial intelligence technology to do that research, but you're hearing it from the voice of the recipients, because sometimes language can be a barrier to doing proper measurement and evaluation. So I quite like that approach to actually hear what is happening rather than what you'd like to happen.
Absolutely. The language barrier is a significant and often overlooked challenge. It reminds me of the Rule of Law Index. While their reports are incredibly powerful, one of the consistent limitations they face is their ability to fully capture community perspectives, particularly in regions with a high number of indigenous languages and dialects. This challenge is especially relevant in areas where impact investors are placing capital. If we're not able to engage communities in the language they feel most comfortable in, we risk collecting data that's incomplete, misinterpreted, or shaped more by what people think we want to hear than their actual experiences. You also touched on another critical point, ensuring that assessments aren't conducted under pressure and that responses aren't just reinforcing existing narratives. In my own experience working with social enterprises, this has been a recurring accountability gap. Without intentional efforts to remove language and power barriers, we often risk missing the nuance and honesty needed to truly meaningfully measure impact. Zooming out, you touched on something really important earlier, the persistent global north, global south dynamic in impact investing. More often than not, the capital comes from investors based in the global north, while the projects and the risks are concentrated in the global south. It's a power imbalance that mirrors older patterns of development and finance. So, how do we begin to disrupt that cycle?
I think government and policy in particular can also make things conducive for impact investing. So they often restrict the amount of money pension funds in their own countries can invest in alternative instruments, such as impact investing. So governments could actually say, okay, we will make it advantageous for you to invest in impact investing because of the social benefit. And therefore, they could provide incentives to encourage pension funds to put more money into this space. That would help get the balance better, because what you want is more pension fund money from local sources rather than international sources coming to the space, because that avoids the whole currency risk issue. Similarly, where the international investors come in, they could say, okay, we will provide this finance, but we also want you to bring in 20% local finance or match it with local finance. And therefore, you could end up trying to blend the international with the local. And what you also need to do is have more data available of what successes have taken place in this space, so that it builds confidence for local investors, particularly the diaspora, who are effectively local investors but living abroad, to send money back to be invested through these impact investing funds, because the track record is such that it gives them confidence that their money will actually achieve not only a social impact, but also a decent financial return. It's down to impact investors to be honest and open about successes and failures, so that you actually have transparency of information and build confidence of what's working. And that's why there's an organization called Novastar in Kenya that did its first fund. I think it was about $30 million. Its second fund is over $100 million. And they not only invest in East Africa now, but invest throughout Africa. And you would hope, as that track record becomes better known, local pension funds in sub-Saharan Africa will say, okay, we will invest in the next fund, because they've seen the track record. We've been teaching on impact investing for 12 years. It's only been around as a term, if I'm not mistaken, since about 2006. Therefore, it's still a young industry. And microfinance has been around for 30 years. So it's still got to prove itself, but hopefully information and evidence and honesty about performance will build confidence and attract more money, particularly local domestic money, into impact investing.
Given how young and still evolving the impact investing field is, I want to end with a bit of a big picture question. If you had the opportunity to redesign the industry from the ground up, what core principles would you keep and what would you change?
Okay, so I would change the balance between debt and equity. And so I would try and have it at least 50-50, equity, quasi-equity versus debt. And when debt is provided, I would also share the currency risk, so that the provider of finance is also taking half the currency risk and not putting all that currency risk onto the recipient. I would have longer term investing rather than shorter term investing. And I would try as much as possible to get local currency domestic investors alongside international ones. I also think that some of the lens investing that we see is healthy. So gender lens investing, child lens investing, climate lens investing, blue economy lens investing. I think these various aspects do move away from a more general impact investing approach to actually targeted social impact investing. I think one of the other impact investment issues is also size of investment. So often impact investors want to make larger investments like $5 million, $10 million, $50 million. And whereas the recipients, like the small and medium-sized enterprise health providers I mentioned, only want to borrow $20,000 or $50,000. So one of the problems we've got between impact investors and their appetite to have impact and recipient entities is the need for more financial intermediaries to actually take the larger amounts and then make them available at smaller ticket sizes to the recipients. That's where these educational finance companies like EdFin in Nigeria, Opportunities International, Ed Partners, Jackfruit, for example, there's Varthana in India. They're trying to provide that financial intermediary role so that the larger lumps of money reach the smaller recipients. So what we need for impact investing really to realize its potential is more financial intermediaries, making the link between the larger pots of money looking to have impact and the small and medium-sized enterprises, which employ most people in Africa and Asia and the world, actually, but typically have problems getting access to credit because the banks are very collateral-based and risk-averse in their approach. So that's where you need more financial intermediaries being able to make the link to get that money to where it's needed. And I think that impact investing hopefully will grow and become a mature asset class. And people will realize if you want to be in a world where inequality is addressed, there's more opportunity. We live in a climate-friendly society and world that just looking for financial returns is very short-term and actually self-destructing. Where we only look for profit maximization, then we will not end up with a sustainable world which is good for people and planet.
Impact investing is a rapidly evolving field that blends financial tools with social and environmental objectives. While its potential is clear, it also raises critical questions about accountability, power, and who ultimately benefits. From how capital is structured to how success is measured, every design choice carries consequences for the communities it intends to serve. For impact investing to live up to its promise, it must center equity, not just in outcomes, but in process. That means shifting who holds decision-making power, listening to those on the front lines of social and environmental change, and building systems that not only are scalable, but deeply accountable. I want to sincerely thank Dr. Peter Hinton for joining me and sharing his insights. His perspective helps us better understand the nuances of impact investing as it exists today and how it might be reimagined moving forward. Art of Citizenry is entirely listener-supported. I truly hope you consider contributing to it by visiting artofcitizenry.com/support. Please remember to subscribe to Art of Citizenry wherever you listen to podcasts and give it 5 stars. Thank you to our producer, Ali Anna Ray, and editor, Stephen Blevins. Original theme music by Katrina Zemrak.